What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients. Interviews with biblical scholars, theologians, philosophers, scientists, all kinds of people in the ivory tower wrestling with age-old questions, the kind we used to ask around campfires. And we drop it right in the podcast feed. It goes in your earbuds, and boom shakalaka, you're thinking with some of the brightest minds around. Yeah, that's what we do here at Homebrewed Christianity. Because we don't want to think for you, we want to think with you. And today on the podcast, a returning guest, friend of mine, Dr. Adam Clark, professor of Black Theology at Xavier University, and he's on. And we are tackling questions sent in by members of the Homebrewed Community. That's right, people that went to homebrewedcommunity.com, signed up, became a member, got the private podcast feed, support the podcast, a part of the Facebook group. All those individuals sent in questions. And I said, Adam, you want to talk about them? And he said, yes. And this is us answering them. Now, we decided to do this because in the new year, 2022, in the middle of January, he and I are starting a brand new homebrewed online reading group called Upsetting the Powers, where we will be exploring the legacy of James Cone, the father of Black theology in America. And we would love for you to sign up for it. If you go to jamesconewasright.com, that's catchy URL, isn't it? jamesconewasright.com, you can sign up. It is 6 weeks. There are readings each week. Each week, Adam and I will get on the Zoom or the stream, you say, and we will wrestle with the text, take questions, engage in conversation and such. And each week, there is a special guest joining us. These special guests are not just amazing scholars in their own right, but individuals who have known, worked with, collaborated with James Cone himself, including amazing people like, Robert Ellsberg, Serene Jones, president of Union Theological Seminary, Gary Dorian, the Niebuhr professor there, Andrea White, Kelly Brown Douglas. Come on. See, this is what I'm talking about. Not only is it a normal homebrewed reading group, meeting community, interacting and stuff, but you also get an extra session where you will not just encounter Cone in a text, but you'll get to hear people share about their relationship with him. So go to jamesconewasright.com and join up. It's a donation-based class, so you can give $0 or $1 million or anything in between to join. Our goal is to have as many of you as possible take some time and wrestle with it. Now, before we hop into the Q&A that Adam and I recorded, I just want to tell you two important things. Number one, my partner, Alicia, had some significant surgery, and I have been attempting to take care of all three children, getting her medicine, getting them to school, and all that kind of stuff. And so, let's just say, I hadn't actually looked at all the questions when we started or told them to Adam. So you get to hear us theologize in real time. And the second thing, I got a brand new toy. Well, it's not really a toy. It's the recorder I use for recording the podcast. The last one died, right? And I got a new one, and it has buttons on it. It's a soundboard. It makes little sound effects like this. Did you hear that? That air horn? Yeah, it makes those kind of noises. And I hadn't really played with it yet when Adam and I started recording, so I just decided to use them and see what happens, which leads to us giggling on a number of occasions and noises that make no sense to what's going on. So, hopefully I will decide not to use them all the time or figure out which ones do what, but I just want to give you a heads up when you get to hang out with a friend and you got a new toy, you try it out. So thank you, Adam, for your patience while I hit buttons, and thank you all for listening. Definitely go to James Cone Was Right, join the reading group, and I will talk to you all again soon. Don't forget, share the brew, my friends. Homebrewed Christianity listeners, this is Trip, and I am here with my friend, the one and the only Dr. Adam Clark. Welcome back to the podcast, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, yeah. I got a sound effect board. Did you hear people clapping for you?
Was that? Oh, that was a clap? That was applause?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Adam Clark is here. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. I couldn't tell if that was applause or roar or like, I couldn't tell what that was.
I don't know, I just got it. I just got this little thingy. Like, see?
Okay, we're big time now.
Yeah, so when people heard Adam Clark was coming back on, they got pumped. And blew an air horn. And
boy, Trip has a toy for Christmas, boy.
Oh, yeah. The thing is, I don't actually know what each of these buttons do. So if I hit them, it could fit or it couldn't fit. So we'll see. I'm just going to hit one between each question because high-quality members of the Homebrewed community sent in questions for Trip and Adam to talk about. And I said, this is going to be exciting. But before we answer any questions, we just want to let you know that coming up, we have an online class starting in the new year, the middle of January. We are doing a brand new reading group, Upsetting the Powers, where we will be exploring the legacy of James Cone. So now, Homebrewed listeners most likely heard about the class last time. And we read Black Theology around specific theological themes. This time, we're going to be reading James Cone, The Inheritors, around different tasks theology has in the present and the way Cone's legacy shapes it. And in addition to us reading and stuff, we have an exciting new feature this year, special guest. So why don't you tell everyone why, if they joined last time or haven't joined before, it would be a real bad idea to miss out on what's coming up.
Well, it's going to be a great class. We've added a lot of special features for those of you who are returning, and we welcome all who are new. This time around, we're not going to just read the literature of James Cone, although that would be enough. We're going to get inside information on how James Cone was as a mentor, a teacher, a friend, a scholar, from people who were his colleagues at Union Theological Seminary, where he spent his entire career, or at least 50 years of it, actually as the father of Black theology. So what you're going to get is not just the literature about Black theology, but you're going to get some inside personal information on what made James Cone tick, what was his impact on students, on the church, and the academy.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I'm pumped about it. And all you have to do to join is to go to jamesconewasright.com. And the class is open. It's online. You can join and go through with us. You can go at your own pace. If you have a group and want to get access to all the videos and the audio and the readings and go with the group, you can do that. All you got to do is go to jamesconewasright.com.
There we go.
Yeah, that was exciting. I didn't know what I was going to get when I pushed that button, but that was pretty exciting. So the first question, I would love to hear how Adam thinks the Black Lives Matter movement has been preserved, or I can't read my own handwriting. All right. Black Lives Matter today, preserved? I don't know. Basically, I think the questioner was asking, looking at Black Lives Matter in the movement and all the energy they had last year, where are we at today, and what kind of prospects does it have going forward?
Wow. That's a great question. And that's part of what we want to do this class for, is to really talk about the energy. Has the energy from the largest multiracial social justice movement of this century, and maybe even ever. I mean, there are more people that participated in the Black Lives Matter movement than actually the civil rights movement, right? Can we harness that energy to really continue the struggle for racial justice, right? It seems to me that there's been a dissipation of that energy, or the intensity of that energy. But the community of faith should be a remnant, right? Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be just following the headlines, but we should be creating the headlines, right? We should be the headlight, not the tail light. And part of what we need to do in order to do that is embrace the prophetic edge of our faith commitments, right? Too many of us have had a kind of follow the followers idea about faith. But really, if you read James Cone and Liberation Theology, you have a leadership vision of Christian faith, that Christianity should take the lead in shaping a more just future and not just follow others who are doing it.
One of the things, a question in my mind comes up is, even if you're doing just association surveys, a lot of the like Black Lives Matter, but also individuals associated with it, movements associated with it, the positive associations have gone down. If you think of the structural changes that the movement was insisting upon, the biggest ones, right, around policing and the prison industrial complex, and then supporting democracy, right, an actual fair vote in America. Both of those, at least at the national level, have been failed. There's been failure to address them, and it looks like they're dead end. And so one of the things I think that I hope we deal with in the class, and I think a lot of us are wrestling with, is yes, there was a whole lot of energy, a profound amount of energy in the Black Lives Matter movement. And once you've come to grips with a problem, once you've stated it publicly, once you've identified with the issue, a lot of times just that act dissipates the energy for change. And so one of the challenges, I think, when we look at our democracy and the problems facing it as Americans, when we look at the structures of power, the state violence and power in policing, in prison systems and stuff like that, that so little has been done, even though there was this moment where there was so much energy and people beyond it. And the change, and especially among white Americans and how they see the movement, was really the moment structural, material change was being wrestled with. Once we discussed changing in policing or protecting voting rights and stuff like that, is when stuff started to change. And so, like, looking at that, I feel like that's a invitation for people of faith that have solidarity and identity with the one who chose the underside, to think about how our feelings show up in this moment.
That's a great analysis, Trip. And it reminds me, there's two ways to kind of look at this. There's more than two ways, but two ways that I tend to think about this. You could look at Black Lives Matter and analyze it from a sociological, political kind of framing, where you're looking at policy outcomes, sociological outcomes. But part of what I've been trying to frame is that we have to look at this theologically, and we have to see this in the context of a new heaven and new earth, right? And what are the energies that actually drove Black Lives Matter as one manifestation of that? Right? It's a manifestation of something deeper. And that's where I want the faith community to go. Because what's happening that the political conditions and the social conditions will come and go. But we have to remain steadfast in our commitment to racial and social justice, independent of any type of spectacular killing of Black men and Black women, right? Like, independent of some type of crisis or some type of outrage, right, which will come and go, right? Yeah. There has to be a commitment by the church. So a generative commitment, not just a reaction to, right? So one thing that progressives have a hard time doing is that we're always reacting. We know what we don't like. Like, we didn't like Trump, right? We didn't like the Trump policies. But what are we for? What are we trying to affirm? And that's where I think the movement needs to come from, not just what we're against, but what we're for. What are we trying to affirm in the world? And that's what Black theology at its best tries to get us to center on.
Oh, yes. All right. So the next question, I'm going to hit one of these buttons and see what it does. Ooh, yeah. Caller on the line. The question is, when thinking about the theological legacy of James Cone, what kind of questions would he beg us to ask during Advent and the Christmas season?
Oh, man, that's a great question. That is a great question. And I was actually reflecting on this about a week ago with some folks. Well, first of all, let me take Christmas, kind of this radical incarnation, that Christmas is God addressing or coming to address human suffering at its very depths, right? So that Christmas should be something that is not just, we memorialize it on the 25th, but it should be an everyday occurrence, right? Like it should be an address that happens on a daily basis. And in this sense, that Cone has a similar insight to Meister Eckhart, that the birth of Christ is not just something that happened 2,000 years ago, but should happen every day internally to us, right? And I think that's number one in terms of that the focus on the liberative possibilities of God entering the depths of human suffering is something that we memorialize on December 25th, but it actually is something that occurs in a daily life. And Advent is similar. There's a type of there's a certain waiting and patience and expectation that liberation is coming, right? That liberation is actually here, but not yet. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what the liberative event that's already here, partially, but will reach its fullness in the future.
Yeah, there is that in Advent, so often the liturgies and the prayers are about the coming of God, saying, come, come. And in the church, as they're waiting attentively, not passively. But the coming of God is not just everywhere, right? Like the incarnation happens somewhere, and it's in a specific place. And it comes through a specific person. And I think one of the challenges that James Cone has always raised for me as a Baptist preacher's kid from the South who's grew up as a white evangelical is that me and my friends would not be the ones that could bear the Christ child. My neighborhood and my home and my church are not the ones that are going to find out first. It's not where the shepherds were, these kind of things. And in some sense, I think like once you take the hermeneutic that Cone invites us to recognize that God has chosen solidarity with the underside and to abstract the particular material and political location of Jesus from the gospel, sets us up to do it in our own day. But once you recognize it, then you start to go and this is a line in one of Luther's Christmas hymns. He goes, "In manger, cross, and empty tomb, we see God's loving face." And yes, that's true, and we celebrate it. But it's just like, where is the manger? It was where they had no room, and it's a young woman who's been cast out and is on the underside. Where's the cross? It's the very place, the violence of the empire. So if you want to get to the empty tomb, God isn't the God with us. Emmanuel isn't just everywhere; it's somewhere. And for those with privilege, then you know where to go. And it's when you end up in those places that you're wise. Right? So like the wise men are wise because they recognize this baby as king and Herod as a fraud. And I think one of the things we're sitting in this moment in American church history is there are a bunch of white Christians waking up to the fact that that Jesus, they thought they were following Jesus, and it was really Herod in cosplay. Oh, that was funny. Oh, I thought I was going to have a joke button. Nope. Where's the joke button? So I'll say it again because I want to use my button, Adam. I know this, so you think this is and I know everyone's listening. I'm not even going to edit this out, but a lot of my Christianity has thought they were following Jesus, but it was really just Herod in cosplay. Oh, there we go.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Trip, because so much of white Christianity is like Disney princess theology, right? Where they see themselves as a hero of the story at all times. They see themselves as Peter, not Judas, right? They see themselves as as the people who anointed Jesus, not as the Pharisees who rejected. so what James Cone does in the context of that is kind of right-center the gospel. And I'm glad you brought up the social political context of the Christmas story, because I still thoroughly take it for granted. Sometimes I don't explicitly say it, but what's happening here, you have an unwed teenage mother, right, who actually can't even get into an inn and has to actually have birth in the manger. And mangers are not nice smelling places, right? Like they're messy. Mm-hmm. They're with barnyard animals. So the birth of God in the context of our human society happened in a messy and smelly place, right? That should give us all like moments of pause and reflection, and even raise the question, what is the good news to the poor that happens both inside of us and outside of us? Mm-hmm. How are we actually participating in this good news to the poor, right? That this is proclaimed as. Yeah. And I think the Christmas story gives us a way of trying to enter into that and try to make meaning out of that in our own kind of existential lives.
Mm-hmm. Amen. All right, next question. Oh, there you go. That's a new sound effect. I'm trying them all out. Oh, we should switch the order since this is kind of connected. All right, so one of the questions was, what do you make of the growing number of people who identify as white evangelical, and yet the number of white people who go to evangelical churches for worship is declining? So there's a recent study, which I tweeted, which I think occasioned the question, is that the Trumpification of evangelicalism among white Americans has actually raised the number or the percentage of white people in America who say they're evangelical. At the very same time, the number of actual white people who go to an evangelical church is declining. And that movement, I think, is revelatory, right? That there are people whose deepest values they saw being expressed in Donald Trump. And who were the biggest cheerleaders? White evangelicalism. So those that were sitting there in those churches and go, WTF, I'm not in this, and are leaving. Right. But then there are others who never went, who were just, like Proud Boys adjacent. They're like, when they started getting surveyed, they're like, what's your religion? They're like, I'm an evangelical. And I think that what you see there is that it's like, when you start to make bolognese at the beginning, the whole pot's full, it's real watery, and then you just let it boil all day, just simmering, and it gets thicker and thicker until it's this beautiful, delicious stuff you put on your noodles. Well, here, it's like everyone that wasn't down for the actual content of the sauce has boiled out, and now the ideology is just becoming clearer as it gets more concentrated, which sets up this this distinction. But
and James Cone really challenges that very idea of white evangelicalism. Can it get out of white tribalism, or what is the difference between white tribalism and white evangelicalism in a post-Trumpian world? Right, like part of what Cone's, especially his earlier literature, he makes the distinction between white religion and Christian faith, and says that these two have, in the context of the United States, has been seen one and the same. But Christianity is a universal and pluralistic religion. White religion is something that's focused on tribal identity. Therefore, the national anthem becomes a holy hymn. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the very depiction of Jesus becomes white. Right? Like everything, therefore the flag becomes a religious symbol that's put in church, right? He says that's a tribal or idolatrous identity. Christianity is about liberation of the poor and the oppressed. It's about setting the captives free. It's about feeding the homeless. It's about welcoming those who are despised. He says that is the religion and the politics of what a faith-based following of Jesus, a creative appropriation of Jesus, ought to be about. And in the context of the United States, that tracks well with the African-American experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And hold on, I'm going to hit a button. Oh, look at that transition. I just feel that was really, really inviting. One of the other questions that came in was, how do you see the relationship between the grassroots activist community and the Democratic Party, really the only party listening and taking seriously the Black Lives Matter movement? Because so often those leaders that end up representing us in Congress, Senate, and such, or even Barack Obama, are learn to play nice with corporatist Democrats. So what do we do with that tension? How do we frame it and think about our task as followers of Christ and his liberating mission today?
During slavery, right, the right side was that slavery's okay. The right perspective was about slavery's okay, and it's a natural order. The left side was about, we need to make slavery more benign, right? The center, the liberative position was about ending slavery. And I think what happens and what James Cone does with Christian faith, he says, we always have to take the liberative position, independent of the left and the right? So that faith is a third rail, right? You have the left, the right, you have the third rail, the engine that keeps things going. And when faith is at its best, i.e. Dr. King, then it energizes the entire field. And that's what we're seek to return to, the catalyst that energizes the field, right? So that the priority discussions are the things that we put our stamp on, meaning that the Bible, right, at least the New Testament, the Christian Testament, right, speaks more about poverty than any other type of socio-political issue. Why isn't that at the top of the agenda, right? Why are certain types of material poverty, ecological poverty, anthropological poverty, right? Like, why don't we speak about that? So what I would say is that instead of always trying to see our expressions as through political parties, right, we ought to drive the conversation of both parties, right? And start the conversation that the conversation of both parties should be driven by a liberative perspective that captures the national agenda. And I think that should be the vision of people of faith, is to actually put that at the center and not be beholden that parties are more like instruments to get to this, right? They're not necessarily things that you have some type of blind loyalty to, but they're instrumental. And I like how the Black Caucus says it. It says, we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And our interests should be in justice.
And do you think that when you think of the faith as third rail, something that's energizing, then do you think that it kind of would shift our focus from those who, or how would you negotiate your focus between kind of over investment and attachment to our current political structures and the way they're making decisions, and the kind of grassroots organizing, connecting, and pushing that the individuals that are part of that structure in their system and their decision making, making demands on them to take account?
Yeah, that's always a danger, right? I like what the word you use is overinvestment, because I think that's what's happened because we have this two-party duopoly, right? So there hasn't been that. So there's been an overinvestment, especially for progressives in the Democratic Party. But there ought not to be, right? There ought to be, we ought to have as much institutional development, contrast communities that actually drive the agenda. So what we ought to do is really try to focus on especially now that we're on Zoom and a lot of kind of online platforms, that we ought to transform these virtual communities into communities that can shape the polis, right? The politics of our community, right? So that therefore these become ways of energizing the conversation and putting priority on certain issues. So King called this a revolution of values, right? What we need is a revolution of values, right? That transforms the way things are done, right? Because you're always going to have very right perspectives and very left perspectives, right? Like, that's not going to go away, right? But what we want to do is actually shape the conversation. And so much of our conversation is about nonsense right now. and part of that is fueled by big corporations, that type of thing, that we ought to at least have the conversation about the right things. And I think that's what our focus ought to be, is shaping people who are in power to have the conversation about things that are most meaningful and substantial in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, so the one of the things that has come up recently, and I don't know if there's a nice way of asking it, but there are two different questions around the anticipation of abortion becoming a topic in religious communities again, right? So the Supreme Court, who knows exactly how the decision's going to be around whether or not Roe v. Wade stands or whatnot, but it's clear that the minority of the country who this is an activating agent are getting more and more influence in legislative ways. And so often, and Barack Obama mentions it in his book about that they had even come to a compromise, right, that would lower the number of abortions and provide more support for people who want to keep their children and provide better health care and all that kind of stuff. And then the extremes of both sides tanked it because they couldn't get caught working with the other one, and they don't know what the next one to do for the next step, right? So this is a difficult issue, but there were a couple of questions around it, but one of them said, what advice do you have for faith leaders as this question comes up again to frame it theologically so that we don't lapse into poles determined by our anxiety or our tribal commitments? So when you think of the question coming back of ethically as a theologian, how do we even frame it or wrestle with it as a person of faith?
Oh man, that is a great, and I'm at a Jesuit institution, just so you know. So this is a very sensitive and touchy issue. It would take a long time to explain in detail, but let me just give some pointers, I should say. Yes, most churches have an official kind of, especially the Catholic Church, a pro-life position, right? Here's another way to think about the sanctity of life. First of all, just out of kind of just social need perspective, even if you criminalize abortion, you don't eliminate abortion, right? Mm-hmm. Like criminalization of abortion will be like the criminalization of weed, right? It doesn't work. Like people are going to go elsewhere. Are you sure? Right, right. So yeah, because they tried it, right? It worked. It was harsher on women's bodies, right? And let me also say this for people who have a pro-life position. Nobody is pro-abortion. Okay, nobody wants this to happen, right? No, at least no person of faith. Let me just say it that way. People of faith, as a general, who are pro-choice, as our politics actually defines that word, are not pro-abort, meaning that they don't root for people to have abortions. They understand it should be rare and only, in exceptional circumstances, and it should be the choice of the woman, right? Let me just say that off the bat. So it's not like we're rooting or we think it's a good and positive things. But what we do think is that people shouldn't be criminalized for it, right? So part of it is about understanding as reproductive rights, right? So that is an idea about personal dignity, that the dignity and autonomy of a woman's body, right, should be the subject of debate, right, as an expression of the sanctity of life. Part of the sanctity of life, right, is about the autonomy of the human body, right, which leads to reproductive freedoms and rights. So if you believe in the sanctity of life, you ought to believe in the integrity of the woman's body, which she should have the choice for, right? So that's a way of trying to think about it, the sanctity of life, in a way that deals with bodies, right, and their autonomies, not just with embryos. And I think that has been missing from this national conversation that we're having.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful. And, when you there's a lot missing, right? I feel like the question of abortion in lots of religious contexts is similar to religious people discussing porn and masturbation, right? Like everyone knows what the correct answer is on it, and no one will ever admit if they don't follow through on it. Right? And so it just like what the correct answer is supposed to do is, and that kind of thing. And in the abstractness of moral declarations from the particularities of anyone's lived experience ends up problematizing the values you're wanting to express. And maybe not in all cases, but I know there are plenty of individuals as a minister who the kind of abstract, either or kind of statement around that issue, it ends up being experienced as relegating to fellow members in your congregation and your community's own lived experience. Like the particularities of their stories are under erasure. And the church for too long makes demands and enforces them without caring to look at the situation and the context for lots of things. So I always worry when this conversation comes up that if you have a deep affirmation of life, that because it's been politicized, then people in their own experience, maybe things they haven't even shared with you, are then experienced as if they don't get to share that. The same way if you're in a youth group and talk about porn or masturbation, everyone talks about it in ways they never tell the whole story, kind of thing.
Yeah, this disembodied. Look, Christianity has had problems because of its Platonic heritage. It's had problems with the body. I mean, this all goes to the idea of that we're embodied beings, right? And Christianity hasn't done a good job of grasping this. And this is part of what liberation theology brings to the fore, right? Its critique of previous theology is that it didn't deal with bodies properly, specifically marginalized bodies, right? But now we're even going further than talking about marginalized bodies. We're talking about sexualized bodies, right? And that's a kind of a new thinking that's come up in the last decade or so, where there's a focus in Christian theology about how do you deal with sexuality in the body or sexualized bodies? Because Christianity has failed so much and had a kind of body denying religion instead of a body affirming religion. And we have to kind of transform from a body denying faith to a body affirming faith. And what does that mean in the context of public policy, right? And that's part of what we're trying to think through here.
Yeah. And I like the line you used earlier about, there's more than one way to basically cultivate a culture of life, right? And if you make it clear in a conversation where every congregation, every group of friends is going to have different answers on this. And I have friends that changed their mind after they became parents versus what they thought before it. Or after an experience of sexual violence, you can change your opinion when you realize should things have gone one way, that same topic is experienced differently. Or what was the governor of Texas Tennessee, when his son came out, then he said, well, I came to a new opinion about gay marriage. Right? Because it touched him. So if you're framing it and wanting to, let them know we are Christians by our love while we discuss it, then the particularities of things, the space you make for a conversation could be one of the best witnesses we have as people of faith in this context, because we know what political parties seeking to animate us through anger and fear are going to do. So if we're going to create a culture of life, which I think is important, then there are so many other features too to consider.
Absolutely.
And so often
a consistent ethic of life, right?
Right.
Like a consistent ethic of life, as the bishop tries to say, not just something that you're talking about prenatal life, but actually after birth, right? What's the culture of life? And I don't mean to interrupt you, Trip, but I really like what you just said in terms of thinking about this. Oh gosh, I just lost my thought here. I just blanked out. Something you said just really struck me as very clarifying in terms of thinking about this issue, because I think you could have integrity to have either position within faith, right? Faith gives you enough resources to have either position. The issue becomes, what's the most loving response? Right? And I think that's what you mentioned. You mentioned the love ethic in terms of that. What is the most loving response, and the response that actually does the most harm reduction, the most suffering reduction, right? Like, if you criminalize women's right to choose, right, will you reduce the harm?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the issue that one must confront.
Yeah, and overcoming kind of like the hyperbolic things on both sides allow people to listen. So like that, anyone that supports a political arrangement of choice doesn't mean they just want to kill babies. And if you are pro-life, that doesn't. I mean, I guess maybe a few, but like when I've facilitated in ethics classes a discussion on this, one of the students gave a good example. He said, he's like, I come from a very conservative family, and at home when I was told him I was preparing on this, I asked my parents, who are conservative Methodists, if there's a fire and one building has 4 million frozen embryos in it, and the other has 1 kid in it, and you can only save one, which one are you going for? And they all chose the kid, right? And it's not like, it's not the state to be a gotcha. It's just that nothing is super clear in this, because so often the rhetoric of being pro-life is like, oh, once you get the magical connection type thing, it gets full dignity.
It's the only Christian position,
right?
That's what people position it as the Christian position. I'm like, it's one Christian position. It's not the exclusive Christian position, right? And, like you get a person of faith and have multiple positions. There's room for debate and dialogue within this.
The other element about this, and assuming things going how it looks, I'll perhaps just do a whole episode, is I think a lot of times Christians don't think about what a particular commitment does to their democracy, right? So if you want to be contributing to the well-being of a nation and as a whole, then this particular issue has been used to wedge between people so that we don't act on a whole host of justice issues. Also, when a minority of the population seeks to abrogate democracy, as the GOP has, to pack a court and all this kind of stuff, to then coerce, not because the majority of the democracy wants something, but a fervent minority who's disregarding the integrity of the democracy, to force it on it, then it's real hard if you're a Christian, right, associated with that, to then be heard by your neighbors who don't have the same position, as if you care about the democracy, you care about their agency and such, because your mechanism for advocacy is a problem, right? Like no one goes around going, I think it's horrible that pro-life Christians organized to give women greater health care and support if they have children, provide like all the other things that could advocate for this. No, you don't get lots of like angry things. It's when you take a democracy and then turn your agency as a small number of them, and then use it to remove agency from others, and in doing so break the kind of basic trust that's at the heart of a democratic process. That's a point.
That's an excellent point, and that's why there is a separation between church and state, right? Because when you want to appeal to publicly accessible reasons, right, for the non-Christian neighbor, right? Like you don't want to appeal to just your faith-based stance as something that's self-evident, obvious, that people who do not share your faith perspective can actually live under a certain type of governing policy that is not contingent on having a certain type of faith conviction to actually practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my snarky response when the person sent me this question was, well, the best theological way to frame abortion is to ask your congregation, how do we abort Jim Crow and the military-industrial complex?
I like that. There are so many things. How we abort evil and oppression and homophobia and patriarchy and white supremacy. How do we abort that? Mm-hmm. Right? Like let's work out. Let's put some energy into that.
Yeah.
Right.
Abort the patriarchy. Oh, see, I remember where that one was this time. All right. So 2 more questions. Well, there's more, but we'll do 2. One, and this came up before we started recording. It is around in our current moment in COVID. How do you process thinking as a theologian, the debate around mandates, masks, vaccinations, because it seems that the United States, unlike a lot, I mean, it's not the same here in Scotland. When I was back home for a wedding, it became very clear when one family and the two black families were the only ones wearing masks at the wedding, and we all skipped out early, right? Like you're like, oh, there's a cultural thing going on here, and so I feel like we need to take a step back, right? Because so much of these decisions and the way we even talk about people on the other side are informed by a kind of animosity coming out of lockdown stuff that doesn't set us up to, one, persuade the other side, or to ultimately invite us all into being better neighbors. So like when it goes to the question of masks, mandates, vaccines and things, how would you, like, what are some ways of framing it theologically?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And what we were talking about earlier is I saw a kind of conversation between Cornel West, Judith Butler, and Glenn Greenwald that helped me think about this a little differently. And my views aren't fully formed, but here's how I think about how I frame the question. Mm-hmm. On one hand, there's a question about the limits of state power, meaning that, and concerns, and rightful concerns, because the left has this and the right has this. Can the government tell you to stay in your house? Can the government shut down your business? How much power does the government have over your own body, right? Like the left has been, and black nationalists have always been critical of the government and suspicious of the government's overreach and power to affect that and to actually coerce that, right? Now you have that with the idea of personal liberty. The issue with personal liberty, right, is the concept of the person, right? Mm-hmm. And that the very idea of personhood in the notion of personal liberty that's being associated with the anti-maskers, right, is something that is so individualistic instead of a relational idea of personhood, right? That my personhood comes from my neighbor, right? I don't want to make my neighbor sick, right? And my well-being is contingent on my neighbor's well-being, right? Mm-hmm. That's where I think the faith comes in, that we have to have a relational understanding of our personhood instead of this autonomous, atomistic, individualized idea that we are persons in relation, that we are, and Lucius said, Christ to our neighbor, right? That there's a certain bondedness that we have, an interrelatedness that we have with others that's contingent on the well-being of me is contingent on the well-being of all. And that's where I see the libertarian argument breaking down. I think there's a just concern about the role of governmental power. I think there's an impoverished conception of what it means to be a human person. I think there's a myth anthropological understanding of that that's caught up in kind of European Enlightenment idealism, and we have to go back to a relational understanding of humanity.
Yeah. No, that element you bring up there, that too often our concept of the person assumes that the individual can really be abstracted from relations. Mm-hmm. Right? So, that's a kind of misplaced concreteness for all you white fans.
There we go.
But I think it's important because it's precisely by making the person concrete apart from their relations that then the logic, right, that comes out that I decide what kind of relationship I have with my neighbor and what responsibility looks like. And so now the abstracted, concretized individual feels like their ethical decision-making is the decision to be in relationship, not that you already are, right? And part of thinking, just what you mentioned earlier in our discussion of Christmas, right? Part of what it means for God to be God with us, for God to have chosen to be in finite relations, means that this abstraction To abstract Jesus from his historical context and his economic, material, sociological situation is heresy. To abstract the individual that is abstracted from relations, that was prized and concretized in kind of Eurocentric crescendo in the Enlightenment. Like all those things bring with it the cutting of the thread of relations that's the very fabric and web of creation. And so, yes, it's an example of it, right? But think of all the other problems we face that are connected to the fact that we're under the myth that we're separate and then choose to relate.
Yeah, I love the way you're saying that. Yeah, that it's actually a choice to relate or not to relate, not that our existence is relational, right? It's not. It independent of your choice. Like what happens in one part, and this should be obvious. What happens in one part of the world that's happening either in China or South Africa has a tremendous impact on what's happening in the United States or Europe. I mean, that should be something that it's not just we're in relationship to the entire Earth and planet, and it's becoming smaller and smaller so that what happens in one part has an impact on what happens in another part. That's the lesson we should be getting, but instead our conversation is about personal liberty, right, in this country, about whether the government can do this and whether mandates are coercion and whether the vaccine is this and that. And I'm like, okay, that's one aspect of a larger conversation that we are tied, interrelatedly. We're in networks of mutuality, tied, the king says, to a single garment of destiny. What affects one in one part of the world is going to affect another person in another part of the world. That should be the bigger picture in which all these conversations are taking place.
Yeah, and you almost sounded like Paul, right? Like, does the hand talk back to the eye? Right, like you're all part of the body of Christ, and we each have like a particular, like gift, situation, tasks, and such. And I think of, so often the American church, and I know I do this because that's where I'm from, right? Like we think about the church in America, but the church is a global body, and right now, there are millions and millions of Christians across the globe who wish they had access to the vaccine. For regular testing, that the infrastructure of support for basic needs have been cut down. I was talking with one of my graduate students on Zoom in Rwanda, and he showed up late, right, to the thing, and he comes in, he's crying, like clearly just finishing crying because his family just now got the first vaccine. And he said, in 2 weeks, I get to go hug my grandfather. Now, and he's a part of the body of Christ.
Yes.
So often that, like, yes, your neighbor who voted to try to cancel out your vote and whatever, but also if Jesus ain't American, and I guess we all hope he's not, then that abstraction that occurs with this kind of the autonomous personhood deals death in ways that we rarely consider. And in the abstract, like, I kind of know that, but then when you hear it and go, and I know lots of people who may be resistant and want to and think like it's their right to preserve the autonomous individual, who, if it was their neighbor, would do the loving thing and help them get access to whatever they need. Yeah. So what is it that turns people who, when they make face-to-face connection, demonstrate the graciousness and compassion of God, but then don't do it when they aren't in front of them? I think so much of it is tied to that abstracted individual. So they decide if they want to relate, as opposed to realize that all things grow together. You are one into and of another.
Well, I think Trip, part of it is that, what is it, like less than 10% of Americans have passports, so they don't know the other parts of the world. So that Americans die from obesity. The rest of the world dies from malnutrition, right? So I heard a South African doctor say, while Americans are turning down shots and vaccines and hoarding them, right, we can't even get enough of them for our country, right? So in Africa, there's a poverty of access to the vaccine. In the United States, there's this type of rejection of the vaccine, right? So it's just two completely different realities, right? And they know what we're doing, but we don't know what they're doing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's been part of, what does it say? If you speak, 3 or 4 languages, you're either Europe or Africa. If you speak one language, you're an American. right? So our type of idea of, we don't take seriously that we are shaped and cultivated by empire, right? And that our lens of being so captured by empire distances us from the humanity of most of the world, right? And Christianity should be a way of breaking through, disrupting that, and identifying and being in solidarity with the world majority instead of being so caught up in the world's minority.
Oh, okay. So that's good. That's good. I'm going to hit a button. We'll see what it does. Oh, no, it wasn't a joke at it. I'm sorry. I'm going to see. Oh, I guess it was a really smooth answer. Oh, well. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Well, the last question is from a partner of a Homebrewed Community member that said, if you were going to give your theology nerd a couple books this year for Christmas, which ones would you recommend? So, if you're thinking of 2 books, let's say, that we are going to give, recommend as high quality gifts. I'll go first, and then you make recommendations, and maybe connect them to the upcoming class. Right. So, because I put you on the spot with this question. Anyway, my first recommendation is Transgressive Devotion. Theology is performance art. Natalie Wigg Stevenson. It's an exceptional book, and it takes theology at a whole new level. It's also she's a really good writer. So on top of it being interesting, it's a lot of fun to read. So that's the first one that comes to mind. Second one is the audio version of Lord of the Rings with Andy Serkis reading it. I mean, it is him reading a book. But I mean, I love Lord of the Rings and I read it all the time. Read it every year. But Andy Serkis, like the guy that does the voice of Gollum in the movies, reads the whole Lord of the Rings and does voices for all the characters. And it was about as wonderful as it gets. Now, if you're not into Middle Earth and such, then it might not be the most exciting thing. The other book I recently read that's fiction that is really good is called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And it is like the UN basically creates a part of it called the Ministry for the Future to advocate for people that aren't alive yet in the face of ecological crisis. And then because corporations and states can't figure out how to respond, they wrestle with the question of eco-terrorism, and then what you do in the middle of it. Do you have technological solutions? It's not one to read before bed, but if you think of what if someone that did a PhD, like PhD quality reflection on philosophy, ecology, economics, a Frederick Jameson student is writing a really fun book to help you think about the future and what it would mean to have a community whose vocation is advocating for future life. Then it's a wonderful book. And if you're a minister, there's tons of things in it. Let's say if you were thinking about wrestling with text and ethical predicaments on behalf of future life, the church should be the ministry for the future, anyway.
So first off, I'm gonna mention The Cross of the Lynching Tree, right? It's James Cone's favorite text. And if you enter into the course and watch the video, you'll hear both his author, or his publisher, I should say, talk about the writing of that book and what it meant to him and how he came up with the chapters and how long it took him and so what are the rewrites and everything. But James Cone poured his heart and soul into really trying to talk about what is the meaning of Christian faith in the context of the United States, in that in order to engage Black suffering, we have to see the cross as a first century lynching, right? And we ought to see lynching as a moment of crucifixion, of a kind of death and resurrection. He does this creative, kind of poetic, imaginative job of trying to weave the idea of the meaning of Black suffering in Christian faith. So I think that's one. In terms of, it's more of an Easter story than a Christmas story, right? It's more talking about the kind of meaning of the resurrection, suffering of resurrection, than it is about the birth. But I think it's a really an important type of work. Secondly, I would also talk about, Kelly Brown Douglas. Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, right? Like that talks a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement and Trayvon Martin, and talks about kind of crucifixion moments, right? And revelatory moments. I think that would be number two. And number three, maybe I should talk about, Gary Dorian. I have so many, interesting moments, but breaking white supremacy, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black social gospel. What he does interesting there is really develop, and he does it in a few texts, but I like this particularly because it focuses on the meaning of Martin Luther King. One of his important contributions is doing that much of what happened to Black theology talked about Black radicalism and more visible protesters. What Gary Dorian does is talk about the Black social gospel, that it's more inclusive of people who did maybe even like reformist projects and not just all these type of revolutionary projects. So he talks about people such as a Howard Thurman, such as a Benjamin Elijah Mays, and some of the Morehouse folks that helped shape Martin Luther King Jr. and also form what he calls the Black social gospel. Generally, when we talk about the social gospel, people talk about Walter Rauschenbusch, right? Exclusively, and trace the lineage through here. He talks about people who were doing anti-slave resistance, suffrage movements, and all of these folks who worked on both race and gendered oppression, and how Christian faith was used to kind of fight that. And I think that's a really important contribution, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of talks about what incarnation might mean in the context of our modern kind of 21st century United States.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I'll put links on the blog post attached to the episode to those. And I know the Crossing the Lynching Tree and Stand Your Ground both have audiobooks. If you're one of those people that listen to podcasts because you have a lot of time in cars or on treadmills or doing dishes. And, sometimes kids book block and you don't get to sit down unless it's your job. So you can check out the audio versions as well. But yeah, I'm super excited about the class with Adam.
Yeah.
All you got to do is go to jamescohnwasright.com. Oh, yeah.
There we go. All right.
Excellent. Well, I'll talk to you later, Adam.
All right. Take care, folks. Come join us. We're looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah.
Recording stopped.